Now, thank you, Florian, and Sebran, and Ian, and Soyon, and Roland, and everyone who organized this event for this conference. And thank you also to all the speakers. This has already been such a fruitful and friendly meeting. I'm very grateful, and so I will try to be worthy of your welcome. And please be merciful for my English. I'm French, and but you can be pitiless if you have any objections. I will. My presentation's title is "Being Part of Nature." Being a part of nature, or being part of nature. Well, in the ethics. Sorry. I'm going to measure time. In the Ethics, Part 3, Proposition 3, scholium, Spinoza claims that passive states are related to the mind only insofar as the mind has something involving negation. That is, insofar as the mind is considered as part of nature, which cannot be clearly and distinctly perceived through itself independently of other parts. And just after that, he adds, by the same reasoning, I could demonstrate that passive states are a characteristic of singular things, res singulares, just as they are of the mind, and cannot be perceived in any other way. This short extract highlights a conceptual field in which being a part of nature is related to negation, passivity, singularity, that is to say, the status of finite modes in Spinoza's metaphysics. Indeed, the definition of a singular thing can be found in the second part of Ethics. It's a definition 7. By singular things, res singulares, I mean things that are finite and have a determinate existence. We have already talked about this definition, but maybe I will talk in a different way. From this point of view, we can say that those three expressions, part of nature, singular things, and finite mode, are several ways of naming the same condition. Now, the question for today is, does this mean being a part of nature is pure negativity? In this presentation, I will first explore the ontological meaning of being a part of nature. For this purpose, I will have to go back to the theory of finite modes or singular things, but also to lay the foundations of Spinoza's mereology and its evolution through time from the short treatise to the ethics. This journey, may I say, will give us the opportunity to take a closer look to a very puzzling text that is the letter 32 to Oldenburg. By doing that, I will try to examine how the qualification of man as part of nature fall within a critical and deconstructive strategy, whose outcomes are, in the end, ethical. The last part of my work today will be dedicated to a reflection on how paradoxically a certain use of negativity can be is in Spinoza, can be seen in Spinoza as a conception of being a part of nature and as a positive theoretical gesture that allows human beings to conceive themselves as able to increase their power. So I will begin with the ontological roots of this. As I have just stated, we can consider part of nature, singular things, and finite mode as provisional synonyms. In the definition of singular things, Spinoza underlines their determinate existence. That this is another way to say that every singular thing is determined by the laws of nature. Indeed, being a part of nature implies to be submitted to its constant ratios. As for the meaning of finite, we can rely on definition 2 in part 1, part 1 of the ethics. A thing is said to be finite in its own kind when it can be limited, terminari, by another thing of the same nature. For example, a body is said to be finite because we can always conceive of another body greater than it. We can first notice that the notion of limit is included in the non-beings list in the first chapter of Metaphysical Thoughts. We imagine as beings all the modes that the mind uses to negate, such as blindness, extremity or limit, boundary, and darkness. Indeed, being limited isn't a positive property of a thing, but rather marks its opposition to the infinite. Thus, insofar as it indicates a negation, the concept of a limit cannot be enough to get what positively constitutes finite things. However, in the same definition, so definition 2 in part 1 of the ethics, limit isn't restricted to a negation. If we read close the text, it's associated to the possibility of conceiving a greater thing. Finite modes have a greatness that can be compared to the others, and therefore they are not mere nothingness. The ambiguity lies in the verb terminare, and I think Roland is going to talk about that just after, so maybe I won't be so long. And I think this is a very elegant way to close the conference, with terminari. But where does a finite mode end or terminate precisely? The common meaning of limit would be that a thing has a term, for it's delimited by others that surround it, and this delimitation forms a boundary between it and the external world. But Spinoza's definition only insists on the difference of greatness. The finite thing is limited, for we can conceive something greater. If we refer to the positive definition of the body in part 2, definition 1, as a mode that expresses in a definitive and determinate way God's essence insofar as he considered as an extended thing, we can see that its greatness should be understood as a quantity of power. Insofar as Spinoza identifies God's essence with God's power. This is proposition 34 of the part 1 of the ethics. Consequently, we can say that a body is finite when we can conceive a more powerful one. And likewise, an idea is finite when we can conceive a more powerful one. The notion of limit stands for a limitation of power, which mainly involves being subjected to external causes. As a matter of fact, to Spinoza, singular things which are involved in causal relations with other things are finite and limited. This is the very meaning of the axiom in part 4 of the ethics. There is in nature no singular thing that is not surpassed in strength and power by some other thing. Whatsoever thing there is another more powerful, by which the said thing can be destroyed. What is limited is the thing as force, that is to say, or as potential, that is to say, as cause. Therefore, being finite doesn't clearly imply a fixed boundary with other things, and this for two reasons. First, causes can compose with one another, as suggested by the end of the definition of res singulares that was recalled this morning. If singular things, if several singular things concur in one act in such a way as be altogether the simultaneous cause of one effect, I consider them all in that respect as one singular thing. That's the first reason why being finite doesn't clearly imply a fixed boundary with other things. And the second reason is that the limit of the finite can change according to the variations of power brought by affects. Indeed, affects are the affections of the body by which the body's power of activity is increased or diminished, assisted or checked, together with the ideas of this affection. Therefore, human beings, for example, don't have a fixed amount of power, but a variable one, depending on their interactions with the world. Spinoza steps aside the common conception of singular things as separate entities and integrates a relational principle to define them. There's a connection between all the parts of nature, and one can't be isolated from the causality net in which it exists and operates. This is the main result of his mereology's evolution from the short treatise to the ethics. I can't develop it all, so I will focus on what is more important for today's purpose. So, in the short treatise, this is chapter 2 of part 1, the notion of part implies the possibility of separation and independence of parts from each other. I quote, "A thing composed of different parts must be such that the parts thereof, taken separately, can be conceived and understood one without another." From this point of view, being a part means being conceivable regardless of the other parts. That is to say, being divided from them as far as division is a mental operation enabling each thing to be considered as isolated, without relating it to the others. Thus, to be composed, or to be a whole, becomes synonymous with to be divisible, at least by thought. This equivalence also explains why in the short treatise the critique of division leads to the disqualification of concepts of whole and part, considered as being of reason. Part and whole are not true or real entities, but only being of reason, and consequently, they are in nature neither whole nor parts. I quote. You can see the text. Division is an abstraction because the substance is indivisible. On the contrary, in the ethics, it is clear that there are parts in nature. The occurrence of parts of nature are so various and so uncountable, or yes, countable, but very, very numerous, so that there are parts in nature. This is not a question, even though there is still a strong critique of division as an abstraction. And when Spinoza refutes that there's a real distinction between the parts of extension in scholium of proposition 15 of part 1 of the ethics, he uses new notions to characterize the relations between parts of nature, such as connection or the action of concurring. I quote, 4. If corporal substance could be so divided that its parts were distinct in reality, why could one part not be annihilated, while the others remain connected, together as before? And why should all the parts be so fitted together as to leave no vacuum? Surely, in the case of things which are in reality distinct from one another, one can exist without the other and remain in its original state. Since, therefore, there is no vacuum in nature, and all its parts must so concur, that there is no vacuum, it also follows that the parts cannot be distinct in reality, that is, corporeal substance, insofar as it is a substance, cannot be divided. Demonstrating the indivisibility of extinction, denying the existence of vacuum, and introducing the idea of an interconnection between parts of matter are dealt together here. Spinoza draws a very original conception of infinite quantity, whether it's a substantial one or a modal one. As Florian brilliantly demonstrated it yesterday, the infinite can have parts, not as the result of a division, but rather as a special kind of distinction between things that still stay in a relation of continuity. Being a part of nature, thus, doesn't mean being potentially separated from the other parts. On the contrary, according to Spinoza, being a part of nature implies to be connected and to concur with other parts, from which it's impossible to divide. So, what happened between the early 1660s and 1675? My claim is that Spinoza has refined his notion of part of nature, while he was forming his late conception of human condition and ethical theory. In order to justify that assumption, I will now study some passages of Letter 32 to Oldenburg, written in 1665, which marks a turning point in Spinoza's evolution on mereology. So, in the letter 32, the conception of being a part is radically different from that of the short treatise. I quote, "By coherence of parts, I mean simply this, that the laws of nature and of one part adapts itself to the laws of or nature of another part in such wise that there is the least possible opposition between them. On the question of whole and parts, I consider things as parts of a whole to the extent that their natures adapt themselves to one another so that they are in the closest possible agreement. Insofar as they are different from one another, to that extent, each one forms in our mind a separate idea and is therefore considered as a whole, not a part. We cannot hear that to conceive a thing as a part, we have to focus on its cohesion with the other parts. Spinoza suggests that the same thing can be considered as a part or as a whole, depending on whether we pay attention to what unites it to the others or to what distinguishes it from them. In that regard, being a part of nature means being connected to the other part. We can see the roots of the conceptions that will be developed in the ethics. Now, how does Spinoza explain this unusual definition of parts and whole to Oldenburg? The letter continues with one of the most bizarre analogies of the history of philosophy, if you want my opinion. I don't have the image with a little worm in the blood. Now I will try to make it in your mind with a lecture, with a reading. Now let us imagine Fingamusiam or Conkipiamusiam, because there are two versions of this letter. If you please, a tiny worm living in the blood, capable of distinguishing by sight the particles of the blood, lymph, etc., and of intelligently observing how each particle, on colliding with one another, either rebounds or communicates some degree of its motion, and so forth. That worm would be living in the blood as we are living in our part of the universe. And it would regard each individual particle of the blood as a whole, not a part. And it could have no idea as to how all the parts are controlled by the overall nature of the blood and compelled to mutual adaptation as the overall nature of the blood requires, so as to agree with one another in a definite way. The image of the worm living in the blood is quite baroque, even if it may have been inspired by contemporary anatomic discoveries. For instance, Kerckring, who Spinoza knew because they were in the Latin school together, in his Spiciliegum Anatomicum mentions tiny worms in intestines. A conclusion drawn from observation with, I quote Kerckring, very remarkable microscope made for me, or him, by this famous Spinoza mathematician and philosopher. But on the one hand, Kerckring's work, published in 1670, postdates the letter 32, although Spinoza may have had direct knowledge of these observations before, but we can just guess, so it's not enough. On the other hand, there is no mention of worms in the blood in the observations of any 17th century anatomists. Nobody speak about that. So we can say there is an element of fiction in this passage. And indeed, this paragraph devoted to the analogy begins with the verb fingamus, or in the original letter, the one in the Royal Society of London, and the verb concipiamus in the Opera Postuma version. This disconcerting fictionalization can be interpreted as an invitation to shift from the known to the unknown, a decentering move whose purpose is to break with a certain conception of humans and their place in nature. The fictional situation forged by Spinoza is that of a worm who imagines its environment as the limits of the universe. It also believes that what it perceives is sufficient to understand the causes of the body's movement. It is trapped, the tiny worm is trapped into an illusion, which is the same as ours. What's interesting here is the way Spinoza introduces this puzzling and, let's say it, vexatious idea, analogy. I've already said that it starts from the known, but not any knowledge. The mention of blood composition recalls the ongoing disputes over blood circulation, and it was quite a rough one, and in general over anatomy, which is a polemical science at the time. The presence of worms in the body carries a morbid imaginary of putrefaction, and it was a well-known fact that doctors often found worms in cadavers while dissecting them. All of this brings humans back to their own finitude. That's why anatomical treatises were sometimes illustrated with images of vanity, as you can see on the front page of the 1642 edition of Vesalius' Epitome, So we are in Belgium. So I had to talk about these ideas. You can see there in the top skulls, little skulls, surrounded by putties, surrounding putties, and there are, well, symbols of vanity and mortality, and so on, in the art of the era. From this already uncomfortable basis, Spinoza forges a new image by mixing all these known elements. He mixes them, as in a fiction. The worm living in the blood, able to sense and understand what's around it, and compares it to us in our part of the universe. So Spinoza's imaginary worm is endowed with faculties that are ordinarily regarded as privileges of superior animals, like sight, or even humans alone, the ability to reason from observation, ratione ad observandum in the letter, while humans are considered on a par with this inferior animal. So in this respect, the worm analogy anticipates another one, which is even more famous, that of the letter 58 to Schuller, which compares us to a stone that is aware of its motion, but not of the origin and causes of that motion. Everyone, I think, knows this text, but I do not resist to the temptation to read it. Furthermore, conceive, poro concipe iam si placet, if you please, that while continuing in motion, the stone thinks and knows that it is endeavoring, as far as it lies, to continue in motion. Now, this stone, since it is conscious only of its endeavor and is not at all indifferent, will surely think it is completely free, and that it continues in motion for no other reason than that it so wishes. This, then, is that human freedom which all men boast of possessing, and which consists solely in this, that men are conscious of their desire and unaware of the causes by which they are determined. There are a lot of similarities between those two letters. In the Latin itself, the expression poro concipiere iam si placet in the letter 58 is almost identical to concipiamus iam si placet in letter 32. But also in the structure of the argumentation. Spinoza starts with scientific knowledge. In this case, in the case of the 58 letters, in the paragraph before, it begins with the physics of shocks. And then he adds a strange fiction in which the stone is suddenly endowed with anthropomorphic mental capacities. In order to reach the real target, humans claim to free will, which is an illusion. Spinoza deviates from the usual path of thought, and we can consider it as a strategy to rip our prejudice off, and a rather rough one. The effect produced by this process is paradoxical. In both letters, the initial anthropomorphic fiction turns against anthropomorphism in order to shatter the illusion made by projecting human desires onto nature. We can notice that between the two letters, 32 and 58, Spinoza goes even further down the hierarchy of creatures as established by theology. The comparison to a worm may not have been brutal enough, may not have been a narcissistic blow effective enough, so we go further. In this image, there's something that aims at humans' place in nature, which is not exceptional to compare ourselves to a small worm, invites us to rethink the scale of our perception and condition. De facto, the letter 32 doesn't satisfy Oldenburg's request of, I quote the letter 31, the one before 32, how each part of nature accords with its whole and the manner of its coherence with other parts. Spinoza admits his ignorance on that. As to knowing the actual manner to this coherence and the agreement of each part with the whole, I made it clear in my previous letter, which letter 30, about war and living for truth, that this is beyond my knowledge. To know this, it would be necessary to know the whole of nature and all its parts. So I shall attempt to give the reasoning that compels me to this belief. But Spinoza, with a warm and fictional analogy, also goes beyond the initial program of distinguishing the notions of part and whole. Because considering a singular thing as a part is not equivalent to considering it as a whole. Spinoza makes it very clear. As long as a worm apprehends each thing as a particle, independent of the other, without understanding that all actually depend on the same nature, the nature of the blood, it cannot perceive what binds them together. Its representation of its universe is atomistic. Singular things are separated from one another as if they were discrete quantities and self-sufficient beings. Yet, this way of thinking is inadequate according to Spinoza. If we want to move towards a more accurate understanding of nature, we have to change our perspective and conceive each thing as within the infinite net of causes that determines its relations with the others. Spinoza claims that only by considering things as parts, we can get, if not a full content, at least a sufficient reason for the connection of the parts of nature. Thus, beyond Oldenburg's request, that conceptualization Spinoza develops in this letter helps us understand why in the ethics the vocabulary of totality almost entirely disappears. To consider a thing as a whole is to apprehend it as a separated unit. That's why the concept of whole is left behind in most of the ethics. But the imbalance between the two notions in the ethics isn't merely critical. There is a positive sense in it, and more particularly to develop the conceptions of things as part of nature. I would say that far from constituting a philosophy of totality or a holism, as we can sometimes read in a commentary on Spinoza, Spinoza's thought from the second half of the 1660s is a genuine exploration of the notion of part and not totality. So it's a merism, I don't know if there is a word for that, but not a holism, which is displaced from its traditional place, the division of quantities. That is a very common way of aborting these questions at the time, and to be reinvested in the analysis of concurring processes. So this will be my final part today, turning negativity into positivity, and I would say that it is the ethical art of being a part. According to Spinoza, we are parts of nature, partial causes, whose power is infinitely exceeded by that of external things. Those who imagine humans to be like a kingdom within a kingdom, apart from another natural things, believe in miracles. They would have to be able to escape the laws of nature, which is impossible. Now, does this mean being apart diminish humankind and condemn us to passivity? To some extent, yes. The condition of part of nature is irreducible, for it's impossible for a man not to be a part of nature, and I quote proposition 4 in the fourth part of ethics. And this condition involves, without a doubt, passivity. Proposition 2 of part 4. We are passive insofar as we are a part of nature which cannot conceived independently of other parts. But being a part of nature is also the key of our empowerment. And this is what I mean when I claim that, in a way, being a part, being aware of the negation, is the first step to the wise ethos, which is not about resigning to passivity, but rather to increase one's abilities, which is the very center of the ethics. In the ethics, the connection between parts is referred with words like concurrere, accomodare, adaptare, extending the vocabulary that was already in the letter 32. The status of part is far from being reduced to the powerlessness and finitude of singular things. The dynamic of accommodation in letter 32 implies both variation and strife. Each part tends to accord with other parts and ward off contrariety. Cohesion is defined as the fact that the laws or nature of one part accommodates itself to the laws or nature of other part is in such wise that there is the least possible opposition between them. Minime sibi contrarientur. Now in the ethics, and it's proposition 5 of part 3, to be contrary means for two things that one can destroy the other. And resistance to contrariety is one of the fundamental properties of the conatus. That is also the essence of every singular thing. I quote the demonstration of proposition 6. Nothing can have in itself anything by which it can be destroyed, that is, which can annul its existence. On the contrary, it opposes everything that can annul its existence, and thus, as far as it can, and as far as it is itself, it endeavors to persist in its own being. So everything opposes its own annihilation, and consequently, its conatus immediately implies the relations with other things. For one part of nature, accommodating itself to the others, thus appears to be one of the ways of opposing everything that can annul its existence, since it is a question of minimizing contrariety, the very cause of destruction. So we also see how the apprehension of finite modes as parts of nature goes beyond the mere consideration of their passivity. Their mutual concurring indicates not only their limitation and reciprocal dependence, but more fundamentally, maybe, their actual essence insofar as it resists destruction. Accommodation, which is the compelling corollary of being a part of nature, has ontological, ethical, and political stakes. Firstly, from an ontological point of view, the concept is linked to the positivity of essence. In fact, it's quite clear that the definition of passivity as being the partial cause of our affects already contains this positivity, paradoxically, because we are indeed one of the causes of our passions. They are partly explained by our nature. Consequently, the status of being a part of nature not only involves cohesion with other singular things, but also the very nature of each thing, insofar as it participates in the living nature. And participates is another way to being a part. This is what being in God means by gathering the proposition 15 and 16 from part 1 of the ethics. We can say that singular things follow from God as a result of a self-modification power, just as conclusions can be deduced from a proposition through the activity of reasoning. So, an immanent cause's effects are in it because nothing is added to it while it produces them, even though this deployment is indeed a modification. Maybe I will be a little faster. Being a part of nature doesn't come to passivity. It surely comes with an ontological dependence, but this dependence itself can allow variations, modifications, and finally indefinite possibilities of increasing our power. By expressing the substantial essence and by participating in the divine nature, we own some power. In addition to that, by conquering, composing, accommodating with the other parts, and with mostly with the ones who are convenient with our nature, we reach more power. And that leads to the ethics. I quote scholium of proposition 18 of part 4 of the ethics. Men, I repeat, can wish for nothing more excellent for preserving their own being than that they should all be so convenient for one another in all respects that their minds and bodies should compose, as it were, one mind and one body, and that all together should endeavor as best they can to preserve their own being, and that all together should aim at the common advantage of all. We already saw that a finite mode isn't limited intrinsically, and now it is clear that it isn't definitely limited either, as long as it's able to extend its power of action thanks to a cooperation with other things. But we have to underline that this growth is only possible by cultivating the relations with the things that are useful or advantageous. The main issue of being a part of nature is therefore to distinguish what brings us to a greater perfection from what prevents us from improving our activity. And the distinction implies both an intellectual strategy, increasing the mind's ability to form adequate ideas, and a corporal one, insofar as, I quote a corollary of proposition 39 in the part 2 of ethics, the mind is more capable of perceiving more things adequately in proportion as its body has more things in common with other bodies, and which takes back, among others, to Spinoza's politics, to form one body, one political body maybe. As long as a community is a less or more achieved composition of bodies and minds. This is where we address the practical stakes of the concept of accommodation, which refers most specifically to the search of what is useful, significantly designated by the term commoda in the ethics. I can't comment on all the occurrences, but you can search. For example, in the scholium of proposition 35 in the part 4 of ethics, the social organization of man shows a balance of much more profit than loss, but I think that it's better to translate commoda. Maybe I change. Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember if I did that. So, well, the commoda, profit here translates commoda, and so on. This dynamic is one of the essential strategy of the reasonable way of life, but also of the art of concord that underlies a city. I quote the appendix of part 4, chapter 12 and 13. It is one of the first importance to men to establish close relationships and to bind themselves together with such ties as may most effectively unite them into one, and as an absolute rule, to act in such a way as serves to strengthen friendship. But for this, art and vigilance, vigilancia, are required. Because it is not easy for us to conceive ourselves as parts rather than as wholes. We need art, that is to say, skills patiently acquired through experience, practice, and method. And we need self-vigilance, because we are always likely to fall back into prejudice and illusions. In that regard, a certain use of negativity may be useful. And maybe this is what Sibran tried to show yesterday. Because reminding ourselves of our own limits not only prevents us from denying reality, it also allows us to turn to other parts of nature and compose with them actions we could never have been able to fulfill by ourselves. In conclusion, the main originality of Spinoza's conceptions lies in the very movable limit that characterizes the finite. There is no strict boundary of a singular thing, and this haziness is also what makes any mode able to stretch its own limits and reach more power and greater perfection. The ethics strategy, thus, doesn't consist in trying to escape the condition of part of nature, which is impossible, but rather in maximizing the possibility granted by such a status. Considering a singular thing in its own is not only inadequate, but also counterproductive. Therefore, to Spinoza, issues like individual freedom, civil peace, or collective progress of rationality are intrinsically connected. So, confronting negativity, even in its brutality, is paradoxically a positive theoretical and ethical gesture. I would even go further and state that my relative powerlessness is perhaps very good news. Not being a kingdom within a kingdom can be indeed a joyful thought, because the idea of a self-sufficient individual cut off from the rest of the world is ultimately rather sad. The illusion of absolute power leads to the imaginary of solitude, even exclusion, where the ego never finds company that matches its so-called greatness and remains frozen in the contemplation of its own finitude, while a full consciousness of my passive condition puts me in a better disposition for suitable accommodations. To extend this thought, I'd like to return one last time to the fiction of letter 32. Perhaps it's also an invitation to create a new imaginary together. The creation of a shared fictional world widens the small window through which one of us perceives reality, like the tiny worm limited to its vision of blood particles. In philosophy, if philosophy, according to Spinoza, consists in seeking a communicable good, in TIE, it may also find an expression in the communication of these baroque images, which decenter us and perhaps develop a new way of linking images, in an order for the intellect, maybe, to use the expression of the scholium of, the proposition 10 of the fifth part of the Ethics, concerning the affections of the body. of which images are a certain type, opening the way to free faculty of imagination evoked in the scholium of Ethics 2, proposition 17. I quote, "If the mind, in imagining non-existing things to be present to it, knew at the same time that those things did not exist in fact, warm in the blood, everyone knows that it does not exist in fact, it would surely impute this power of imagining not to the defect, but to the strength of our nature of its." What is this translation? Yeah, there is a. Well, maybe you know the text. So, as the faculty of imagining were free to deliberately forge the image of a worm living in the blood, while being perfectly aware that it corresponds to no biological reality, in order to project ourselves into a new apprehension of our place in nature, may be a free act of imagination, drawing from the affective worth of the image a force that supports reason in its effort to understand what is so difficult but so salutary to understand. I thank you very much.